Good evening, everyone. Hello, Elaine, Gabriella, James, Geeta, Jens, Bradley, Richard, Scott, Ethan, Kevin, Edward, Demi, Lilia, Diane, Julia. Lots of people very interested in Theravāda and Mahāyāna. There are questions already in this hot topic. Geeta says, Bhante Suddhāso, it's been said by other venerables that, okay, this is a question for later. And then...
There's enough questions, we might just go directly into Q&A.
And James says, welcome, Geeta and Bradley. Woohoo! I'm so psyched for this topic. And Richard also says, I've been looking forward to this one. Lots of expectations. Hello to more friends, Sally, Cunning Corbid, very interesting nickname. Lids, Key. Gabriela says, yes, I'm also worried.
Worried about what?
I don't know.
Okay.
Just one. Also worried. And Key says, very excited about this topic. Anyway, so there's lots of enthusiasm, Bhante. So we will start by chanting the Ratana Sutta first, doing some meditation so we can practice equanimity towards the subject matter that produces excitement, and then delve into it.
Okay, so we'll start with chanting the Ratana Sutta.
Gabriella says, poor Bhante will have his hands full this topic.
Oh, that's fine. I'm more than up to it.
We'll see.
So we'll do the Ratana Sutta chanting. So right before we started, Ayasoma told me not to chant like a man, because when I chant like a man, it's hard for her to harmonize. So I'm still not exactly sure what she means by that, but I'm going to try to not chant like a man tonight.
I didn't quite use those words, but...
It was pretty close. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Sammāsambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Sammāsambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Sammāsambuddhassa. Yani tabhutani samagatani bhummani vayani vantaleke. Sabeva bhuta sumana bhavantu atopi sakacha sunantu vasitam. Tasmahi bhutani sameta sabe metam karota manusiya pajaya. Divacharato chaharanti ye balim tasmahi nerakata apamata. Yam kinchivita vidavahuram vasage suvayam ratanam panitam. Nano samangati tathagatena idampi buddhe ratanam panitam. Etena sacena suvati hotu. Kayam viragam amatam panitam yadajjaga sakyamuni samahito. Natena dhammena samati kinchi dampi dhamme ratanam panitam. Etena sacena suvati hotu. Yam buddha seto parivannai suchim samadhimanantare kanyamahu. Samadhinatena samona vijjati dampi dhamme ratanam panitam. Etena sacena subhati hotu. Ye Pungala Tasatam Pasata Chattari Etani Yogani Honti Te Dakineya Sugata Sasavaka Ete Sudindani Mahapalani Idampi Sanghe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Yesu Payota Manasa Dalhena Nikamino Gotamasasanamhi Te Pati Pata Matam Vigaiha Landamutani Buddhim Punjamana Yedampi Sanghe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Yatinda Kilo Patavim Sito Siya Chatu Vivate Via Sampakampio Tatupamam Sampurisam Vadami Yo Arya Satchani Avecha Pasati Vedampi Sanghe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Ye Arya Satchani Vibhavayanti Gambhira Panyena Sudesitani Kinchapi Te Honti Busapamatana Te Bhavangatamam Adiyanti Yedampi Sanghe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Sahava Sadasana Sampadaya Taya Sudhamma Jahita Bhavanti Sakaya Diti Vichike Chitansha Silabhatam Vapiyadatti Kinchi Chatuhabaye Nichavipamuto Chachabhitanani Avambo Katum Idampi Sanghe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Kinchapi Sokam Mam Karoti Papakam Kayena Vacha Uracheta Savam Avambo Sota Sapatichadaya Avabbata Ditapada Savutam Vidampi Sanghe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Vanapagumbe Yata Pusitagye Gimhanamase Patamasmin Gimhe Tatupamam Dhammavaram Madesayi Nibbanagamim Paramam Hitaya Yedampi Buddhe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Varo Varanyo Varado Varaharo Anutaro Dhammavaram Madesayi Idampi Buddhe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Kinam Puranam Navam Nati Sambhavam Virata Chitta Ayatike Bhavasmim Te Kina Bija Virodhi Chanda Nimbanti Dhirayatayam Padipo Idampi Sanghe Ratanam Panitam Etena Sachena Suvati Hotu Yani Bhutani Samagatani Bhummani Vayani Vantaleke Tathagatam Deva Manusapujitam Buddham Namassama Suvati Hotu Yani Bhutani Samagatani Bhummani Vayani Vantaleke Tathagatam Deva Manusapujitam Dhammam Namassama Suvati Hotu Yani Bhutani Samagatani Bhummani Vayani Vantaleke Tathagatam devamanusapujitam sangham namassama suvati hotu. Etena sachavanjena dukavopasamentu te. Etena sachavanjena vayavopasamentu te. Etena sachavanjena rogavopasamentu te. Okay, so please get in meditation posture, and now we'll do some meditation practice together. So, as an act of compassion, tonight I will permit you to sit in the full lotus position. In fact, as an act of compassion, I will encourage you to sit in the full lotus position. And Ayasoma has rolled her eyes 3 times in the last 10 seconds. First, I was going to say, as an act of compassion, I'll allow you to not sit in the full lotus, but I realized that would not be compassion. That would actually be the opposite. Compassion is encouraging you to push your limits. And Ayasoma rolls her eyes a couple more times. All right, so settling into meditation posture. Sitting up nice and straight. Taking a few long, slow, deep breaths. With each breath, letting the body and mind relax. And settling into awareness of the body. Collecting together attention, holding the mind steady in clear awareness of the body. And from that place of awareness of the body, also be aware of the mind. sensations of body and mind. And in particular, bring attention to any sensation of unpleasantness, any sensation of displeasure, discomfort, whether physical or mental, any experience of dukkha in body or mind. It might be the dukkha of physical pain, the dukkha of tension, the dukkha of too cold or too hot, the dukkha of itchiness, the dukkha of restlessness, the dukkha of boredom, the dukkha of depression, the dukkha of sadness, the dukkha of resentment, the dukkha of irritation, the dukkha of confusion, whatever it is, just be clearly aware of the experience of dukkha, that underlying core feeling of dukkha that underlies all its manifestations. Getting really in touch. What is that feeling of dukkha, that feeling of suffering, that feeling of discomfort, of unease? That subtle, pervasive feeling that something is wrong. Clearly feeling dukkha. And as you become clearly aware of dukkha, then gently wish, may I be free of suffering. May I be free of pain. May I be free of sorrow. May I be free of depression. May I be free of dukkha. Just keep wishing. May I be free of dukkha in all its forms. May I be free of dukkha. May I be free of dukkha. Really sincerely wishing this for yourself. Sincerely wishing for all the dukkha, all the suffering, all the unease, the discomfort to fade away. wishing to be free of all dukkha. May I be free of dukkha. And as you do this wish, try to make it a peaceful, serene, joyful wish, not tinged with sadness or longing or despair. But if you notice this wish coming with longing, despair, sadness, then recognize that that also is dukkha. And wish, may I be free of this dukkha as well. May I be free of the dukkha of not having attained my wish to be free of dukkha. Just folding it back into the meditation. May I be free of dukkha. May I be free of dukkha. May I be free of dukkha. If you start to get distracted, just come back to feeling dukkha, being clearly aware of dukkha. It's never far away. It's always right here, like a subtle smell of decay, a faint scent of rot. It's always right here, feeling of dukkha. Recognize the feeling of dukkha and wish, may I be free of dukkha. May I be free of dukkha. Recognizing it is not just me who feels dukkha. All sentient beings feel dukkha. It is not just me who wishes to be free of dukkha. All sentient beings wish to be free of dukkha. So bring up the wish. May everyone be free of dukkha. May everyone be free of dukkha. May everyone be free of dukkha. Okay, you can relax your posture. So I'm told that there's a number of questions. So maybe we can start with going through whatever questions are already there. And maybe that will be enough to spark the discussion. If not, then I'll talk for a little bit. So if you could read the questions, whatever's already written in.
All right. Thank you, Bhante. And welcome to Mark, Adriana, Jen, and Stacy, who says, what a great topic for discussion tonight. Everybody's very excited. And welcome to Victor as well. All right. So Gita was asking, Bhante Suddhāso, it's been said by other venerables that Theravāda is the walking path to awakening. Mahāyāna is taking the vehicle to awakening, and Vajrayana is taking the plane to reach awakening. What are your thoughts on this matter?
Well, I never say that, so you'll have to ask whoever said that what they mean by it. Certainly that's not something the Buddha said anywhere that I'm aware of. The closest you get is in the Lotus Sutra, for example. The Buddha says that the Ayasama already looks unhappy because she doesn't like the Lotus Sutra.
Well, it's more the Buddha says in the Lotus Sutra. According to the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha says.
According to the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha compares the Theravāda to being like I think it's a wooden cart drawn by a donkey. And then the Mahāyāna is like the Pacceka Buddha vehicle, I think, is like a silver cart drawn by a horse. And then the Mahāyāna is like a gold vehicle drawn by a stallion or something. But the interesting thing is that all three of those carts will travel at about the same speed. So there's some difference in appearance, but they all go at about the same speed. And the Lotus Sutra also seems to be implying that they all wind up at the same place. That the difference is in the appearance of the cart, not necessarily in its capability or its speed. So that's actually from a Mahāyāna Sutra. I don't know of any Mahāyāna Sutra which says that the Theravāda is like walking and the Mahāyāna is like driving a car and the Vajrayana is like flying an airplane. I don't know of any Sutta or Sutra which says that. So you'll have to ask whoever said that what they meant by it, because I could only guess.
James says, tension for this topic is so hot you could cut it with a butter knife.
Well, I'm not tense. So you'll have to look at that feeling of tension and the accompanying dukkha and wish for all beings to be free of that dukkha.
And Sally says, could Bhante explain Nibbana doesn't mean leaving this world? In the morning talk, I thought it is at least leaving the two beloved ones. One of the reasons I'm still not aiming to attain Arhatship yet is I feel after Nibbana, I can't help them, the loved ones, substantially.
Yeah, you've definitely got a misunderstanding now. So this idea that attaining Nibbana will prevent you from helping your loved ones is exactly the opposite of the truth. The single best thing you can do for your loved ones is to attain enlightenment. There is no better gift you could give to your loved ones. There is no greater way you can be of benefit to your loved ones. Okay.
Maya says, how is that the Buddha is only born in Asia? Any particular reason? Why couldn't Buddha be from the Caribbean?
The Buddha could be born anywhere, in any place. It just so happens that this time around he was born in northern India. It could be any time, any place, wherever the conditions are proper. So it doesn't necessarily need to be Asia. In fact, keep in mind that there are countless worlds and countless eras, and each one is going to have its own particular continents and its own particular countries. So the Buddha could be born under any of a wide variety of different geopolitical conditions. It's kind of beside the point. Yeah, I wouldn't get too hung up on the fact that this time around the Buddha was born in India. It's really not so significant.
There is a passage, though, in the Pali Canon that talks about previous Buddhas, basically. Was it born in India, or definitely eating Asian food always, all the time, which I found very peculiar.
If you can dig up the particular sutta reference, we can look at it.
Yeah, I don't remember. I read it long time ago, and I had asked you, actually. You said it was a metaphor.
Anyway, if you can find the sutta reference, we'll talk about it.
Anyway, James says, do the Pureland Sutras date back similarly to the Pali Nikayas?
Well, now you're getting into the very dense and sticky subject of how to date the different Buddhist scriptures. So, for example, you're assuming that the Pali Nikayas are very old, which that's an interesting assumption, isn't it? Actually, the single oldest physical Buddhist document that we have is some fragments of the Dhammapada inscribed in stone in the language of Gandhari. So not Pali, not Sanskrit, but Gandhari, which is somewhat similar but rather different from both, which were found, I believe, in modern-day Pakistan. So in what used to be the northwestern end of India, before it became, well, I mean, again, political boundaries are always shifting and changing anyway. But anyway, Pakistan, modern-day Pakistan. And it corresponds not too far off from the Dhammapada that we have. It's relatively close. If you're really interested, Bhante Ananda Jyoti, who runs the website Ancient Buddhist Texts, Bhante Ananda Jyoti has done some interesting comparison of the Gandhari Dhammapada fragments with the Pali Dhammapada and the Chinese Dhammapada. Again, it's quite interesting to see how that all lines up. Anyway, that's the oldest actual physical Buddhist text that we have. The next oldest was a bundle of scrolls which were found in a cave in China, the Dunhuang caves. And those are all Mahāyāna texts. So those are the next oldest actual physical remnants of Buddhist scriptures that we have. After that, there's various bits and pieces over the centuries, but nothing particularly old, because books have a tendency to fall apart over time. And apparently, not many people took the effort of inscribing things in stone or metal. So we do have some very old stone inscriptions, some very old metal inscriptions, and so on. In some cases, some old wooden inscriptions, but wood also doesn't last the test of time very well. So a lot of the work of trying to figure out and date the origin of texts is conjectural. So it is my personal belief that much of the Pali Suttas dates back to the Buddha, comes from the Buddha. But that's because of its content, rather than any archaeological proof thereof. As far as history goes, the current running theory is that what we call the Pali Canon was compiled in the 5th century CE in Sri Lanka. So using texts which were already circulating in one form or another, and which most likely, again, much of it dates back to the Buddha. But it was also composed at a particular monastery, which was under direct control of a king who had an extreme anti-Mahayana prejudice, and who made it his personal mission to try to purge Mahayana Buddhism from the island of Sri Lanka. So that also no doubt influenced the compilation of the Pali Canon quite significantly. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. The Mahayana Sutras, it's quite difficult, similarly, to date exactly when the Mahayana Sutras arose. So mostly what's relied upon is comparison of content. Since archaeological remains are hard to come by, mostly they go by content and style. The other thing which they go by is the date given to the Chinese translations of texts. So this is one point where the Chinese record keeping proved to be much more robust than the record keeping in Sri Lanka. So the Chinese would put a timestamp every time they made a translation of a Buddhist text. They would write in the year. So the oldest Chinese translations are dated to around 100 CE. So quite early after the Buddha's passing, just a few hundred years after the Buddha's passing. And that's where we find some texts like one of the three Pureland Sutras. So one of the three Pureland Sutras, the shortest one, which also is the one which is the closest in style to the Pali Suttas, and which has the least doctrinal issues, is probably a very old text, probably at least 2,000 years old and possibly older. It might even come from the Buddha, or it might be based upon something that the Buddha said. Similarly, the Prajnaparamita texts, the shorter versions of the Prajnaparamita, probably came similarly, or at least 2,000 years old. The Sutra of 42 Chapters, which also is very similar to Pali Suttas, similarly at least 2,000 years old. Again, if you look online, you can find other scholars who've done very deep studies into which Mahayana Sutras are most likely very, very old and most likely date to close to the Buddha, if not directly from the Buddha. And then there's later texts which mostly, again, based on content and style, almost certainly were not from the Buddha. So that does include things like the Shurangama Sutra, although it's very popular in East Asia, it almost definitely is not from the Buddha. In fact, indications are that it was probably composed in China, in Chinese. It's probably never even in India at all. Similarly, most of the Tibetan Buddhist canon is considered to be quite late. Things that were composed at least 1,000 years after the Buddha's death. And again, this is mostly based on style and content rather than on archaeological evidence. But yeah, the short Sukhavyahati Sutta, the short Amitabha Sutra, which in Chinese is just called The Buddha Talks About Amitabha, Fosho Amitofo. This is a really old text. It's been around for a really, really long time. And it doesn't contain the problematic doctrinal things that you find in the later Amitabha Sutras, including the blatant misogyny that appears in the longer Amitabha Sutra is not present in the shorter Amitabha Sutra. The inexplicable hatred of Arahants and Theravādans that you find in a lot of the later Mahayana texts, you just don't find it in the early Mahayana texts. The early Mahayana texts are mostly quite friendly towards Arahants, quite friendly towards Theravada ideas and practices. Anyway, they may have been a bit more than you were asking for.
And speaking of misogyny, James says, I think the Lotus Sutra says something about women being unable to awaken.
So I I haven't looked at the Lotus Sutra recently. I read it 2 or 3 years ago in full. To be honest, I wasn't terribly impressed. There's a couple nice things in there. The chapter on skillful means is pretty good. The description of Avalokiteshvara in the Universal Gate chapter, that's pretty good too. And in fact, those historically have been the 2 most popular parts of the Lotus Sutra. The simile of the burning house also is pretty good, though there's 2 main ways of interpreting the simile of the burning house, one of which I like and which smells like Dhamma, and one which I don't like and which smells like non-Dhamma. But pretty much the rest of the Lotus Sutra, I was not impressed. Didn't really strike me as having much Dhamma content worth note. Yeah. And the Lotus Sutra, again, based on content and style, it's almost certainly a later text.
And Marielle says, could karma be that you intend to become an Arahant and then end up becoming a Bodhisattva or vice versa?
Depends on what you mean by karma. So karma means action. It means what you do, what you intend and what you do. What can happen is we can have conflicting motives. And we can also carry very strong tendencies, especially from past lives, which may not always line up with what our conscious attitudes are in this life. So for example, I've had to come to grips with the fact that I have a very strong tendency towards the Bodhisattva ideal. Despite trying to practice Theravāda for many, many years, I still have a very strong inclination towards the Bodhisattva path, towards the Bodhisattva ideals. And that's okay. Can someone still become an Arhat even if they've been practicing the Bodhisattva path? Yeah, absolutely. It's a matter of intention and action. Can someone who's been practicing the Arhat path become a Bodhisattva? Yeah, absolutely. It's a matter of intention and action. So in that sense, yeah, your karma can change your path. But this is also running off the assumption that these are 2 different paths, which is not necessarily true. It's really amusing to watch Ayasoma's face through all of this, by the way. It'd actually be really great to play poker with Ayasoma because she'd be guaranteed to win every time. I could just see her like, she draws her cards and she's like, I have a really bad hand. Yes, terrible cards. I have drawn very bad cards.
I guess I'm expressive.
Yeah.
And Gabriela says, I hear a lot of polemic about compassion of the Arhat and the Pachika Buddha and wonder why there is so much disdain towards awakened beings who are free of all the fetters.
Yeah, mostly misunderstanding. And also a misunderstanding of compassion. So it's actually really clear in the Pali Suttas. The Buddha says there are 2 kinds of beings who arise in the world for the benefit and welfare of the many folk, out of compassion for the many folk. A Sammāsambuddha and an Arhat. So the Buddha is extremely clear that an Arhat has extremely strong compassion. How could they not? They're completely free of self-centeredness. They're completely free of all unwholesome tendencies. Their mind is purely wholesome. Their mind inclines only towards what is wholesome. They do only what is wholesome. So how could one possibly look down on such a being? Okay.
And Stacy says, if Buddha was born in the Caribbean, how would that have changed the suttas? Kind of cool.
Okay, next question.
Would be the same, but actually, yeah, there will also be a lot of mentions of rice in the Caribbean. They always pick that rice too. Had he born in Italy then, more pasta. And Victor says, Sammāsambuddha, born in Jambudvipa, is in Sutta, I think.
Yeah, and then the question becomes, what does Jambudvipa mean? And there's different theories around that. Some people think Jambudvipa means India, but elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha seems to be saying that Jambudvipa means the whole human realm. And again, it's not clear by that if he means the earth or if he means all human realms. So I wouldn't get too hung up on that. So there's also somewhere in the sutras where the Buddha describes the so-called 4 continents. And it's very clear that the other 3 continents are not on this planet, not in this world. It's a very different state of existence than what we experience here in this human world. So my understanding of that was when he says that a Sammāsambuddha is born in Jambudvipa, he means that a Sammāsambuddha is born in an ordinary human world. Not in a Deva realm, but also not in a human world where things are Deva-like. Though he also talks about there being a past Buddha who was born at a time when humans lived for tens of thousands of years. And when there was very little illness and very little of the ordinary physical dukkha. So he also mentions that there's quite a range of conditions under which different Buddhas are born. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the whole Buddha's born in Jambudvipa thing. It doesn't necessarily mean India. In fact, I've always found that explanation to be quite unsatisfying, unlikely.
And Gita says, Bhante, the 10 stages in the Bodhisattva path, is it somewhat the same as the Theravāda jhana, mundane and the super mundane stages?
No, it's nothing to do with jhana. No, those are stages of development of the paramitas that lead to becoming a Sammāsambuddha. And where there is some lineup with the Theravāda system is that the 8th Bodhisattva stage is called the Stage of Non Regression. So if one reaches the 8th Bodhisattva stage, then at that point one is no longer subject to backsliding, and one will unerringly progress towards full enlightenment. So in this, there is some analogy to stream entry. But otherwise, they don't map up together terribly well. It's a different description of the path to awakening.
And Marielle says, pretty basic question, and I think I know the answer, but I still have some technical doubts. Does everyone who become enlightened and break the cycle of samsara become a Buddha? Or the Buddha is the enlightened one who decides to teach while the others enlightened ones just leave?
So I'm actually happy you asked that, because my original plan, before I was told that there were lots of questions in the chat already, my original plan was actually to start by talking about the 3 kinds of enlightened beings, because this is important in order to comprehend the whole issue of why Theravāda and Mahāyāna practitioners think they're doing something different from each other, which again, I'm not entirely convinced they actually are doing something different from each other, but that's, again, a longer discussion. So a Sammāsambuddha is somebody who attains enlightenment by themselves without a teacher, and who has developed a full set of teaching abilities that allows them to teach the path to others, guide others to full enlightenment as well. A Pacceka Buddha is somebody who attains enlightenment by themselves, but who, prior to awakening, had not developed sufficient teaching abilities to guide others to awakening. And an Arahant is somebody who attains enlightenment by following the instructions of another, and who may or may not have the abilities to guide others to awakening, depending also on what conditions they developed prior to awakening. As for your question about whether or not they just leave, well, while they're alive, regardless of which one of these 3 kinds of beings they are, while they're alive after awakening, then they tend to continue helping people And in particular, they tend to continue teaching the Dhamma. Unless they're completely incapable of teaching, which does occasionally happen. Again, depending on what karmic conditions one had developed prior to awakening. An Arahant or Pacceka Buddha definitely is not capable of teaching the Dhamma for enlightenment. They might be able to teach some lesser Dhammas, but not the supreme Dhamma. And an Arahant may or may not be able to, depending on what they've cultivated prior to awakening. So those who are capable of teaching definitely do. Those who are not capable, well, they provide an example of what's possible. And they can provide inspiration just by their purity of mind. So they may not be able to guide people to full awakening, but they can still serve as an inspiration and an example, and they can still instruct in lesser Dhammas, lesser aspects of the Dhamma. And then there comes up the question of what happens when they pass away. And again, the clearest answer the Buddha gives is that one cannot speak of them as either reappearing or not reappearing. And that applies to all three categories of beings: the Arahant, the Pacceka Buddha, and the Sammāsambuddha. Okay? Next question.
Well, there is some amusing comments on wish we had a picture-in-picture of Ayasoma.
Yes. Yes. It's just fascinating. It's like I have my own little TV show to watch here. And also it's really amusing because I also know instantly if she disapproves of anything that I say. Which basically happens whenever I start talking about Mahayana, by the way.
Well, no, it depends on how you talk about Mahayana. Besides the point, Bradley says it's interesting that researchers have found that the early schools in India very much intermingled, even when Mahayana and other doctrinal differences arose. It seems like the Bodhisattva and Arhat paths have more to do with intention rather than school or vehicle.
Yeah, and this is also something really interesting, which is that if you look at the actual practices which are done, there's really not that much difference. We're all doing basically the same thing. We're practicing Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. We're practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. We're cultivating wisdom and compassion. We're developing a recognition of impermanence and not self. We're trying to understand and implement the Four Noble Truths. It's really not dramatically different. And this is, it's especially clear when looking at the older strain of Mahayana texts. They really don't read dramatically different from Pali suttas. There's a big emphasis on morality, on renunciation, on samadhi. There's a big emphasis on seeing impermanence and not self. There is a big emphasis on cultivating compassion in both Theravāda and Mahāyāna sutras. So there's sometimes this pervasive idea that Mahayana has compassion, but Theravāda doesn't. But if you read the Theravāda suttas, it's absolutely packed with compassion. It's all over the place. You would have to be an incredibly selective editor to cut out all the compassion from the Pali suttas. And similarly, you look at the Mahayana sutras and they're jam-packed with renunciation and wisdom. So there's also this idea that Mahayana lacks the renunciation qualities and the deep insight practices. But this is also completely untrue. The more closely one examines the actual practices prescribed in Theravāda and Mahayana, the harder it is to find clear differences. Okay, so this time, rather than Ayasoma's look of persistent disgust, instead we got some approving nods and even a thumbs up. I actually kind of wish that I just had like a blank screen so I didn't see her incredibly wild variations of facial expressions, because it's a little distracting sometimes. Maybe I could mirror Ayasoma's facial expressions whenever I say things. So I'll be like, so, and then we realized that Theravāda and Mahayana are maybe not so different. And I say something like, And the Buddha said in the Lotus Sutra, anyway, so carrying on, what's the next question?
Okay, that was funny. So there was an interesting conversation about the Buddha being born in the Caribbean, which is really cool. And the answer is what Bradley says. But fun fact is actually that Bradley says also that concepts of rebirth existed in indigenous religions too. Very interesting. Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, this is something really interesting. If you look at the anthropological study of the development and history of religions, the teachings on rebirth and reincarnation are found in countless religions all over the world for as far back as human history dates. So, of course, some religions haven't taught that, but quite a number did. And also some of the early Christian churches had teachings of reincarnation, which very early on got stamped out by the arbiters of orthodoxy, but it was present for the first 200-300 years in some schools of Christianity even. Anyway, beside the point, next question.
Sally says, if someone takes the Bodhisattva precepts and Bodhisattva vows, that person has to give up the vow first to attain stream entry, right? If so, how to change the vow to be able to attain stream enter?
Why do you think you have to give up a vow? Yeah, I don't see what the problem is. In fact, I recommend not getting so caught up in this idea that if you practice to be a Bodhisattva, then you can't practice Theravāda. Or if you're practicing to be a Sammāsambuddha, that you can't attain a stream entry. If you're practicing to attain stream entry, you can't become a Sammāsambuddha. It's just getting caught up in ideas. Realistically, what you should be doing is following the Noble Eightfold Path, developing Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, cultivating wisdom and compassion, practicing kindness and generosity. That's what you should be doing. Form the aspiration to attain awakening for the benefit of all beings. But don't get so caught up in trying to pick and choose. The picking and choosing is just your self-centeredness. It doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism.
And Gabriela says, what are the differences between the three Buddhas, Sammāsambuddha, Paccekabuddha, and Sammāsambuddha in Mahāyāna and Theravāda Buddhism? And can their disparate views be reconciled?
So there are some differences in viewpoint. So traditionally in the Theravāda exposition of this, it said that all three kinds of enlightened beings have exactly the same knowledge of the elimination of the defilements, exactly the same realization of Nirvana, so exactly the same direct seeing of absolute reality. All three of them have freedom from rebirth, so they're no longer bound to compulsory rebirth. Whether or not they can engage in voluntary rebirth is an interesting subject of debate, which has never been resolved as far as I know, because it's not something the Buddha directly talked about. So it's an interesting subject of debate. Can an Arahant voluntarily be reborn? That's an interesting question, which I've never seen satisfactorily answered anywhere. But they're definitely free from compulsory rebirth. They have no conceit of self-existence, though interestingly enough, in Tibetan Buddhism, that gets redefined a bit, so I'll talk about that shortly. What is different between the three is primarily the conditions under which they attain awakening and whether or not they have teaching abilities. It's the main difference. There are a handful of places in the Pali Sutras where it does also indicate that there is some domain of knowledge which is only accessible to a Sammāsambuddha. There are some aspects of wisdom which is only the domain of a Sammāsambuddha, that is not accessible to an Arahant or a Paccekabuddha. And that also is an interesting thing, a little interesting detail. So this is the Theravada standpoint. The Mahayana schools can be, broadly speaking, we can divide it into East Asian Mahayana and the Vajrayana, which is usually associated with Tibetan Buddhism. So in East Asian Mahayana, there are actually some divisions and interpretations. There's actually a lot of different opinions all throughout the Mahayana and Vajrayana world. But in the Mahayana world, there are some who regard Arahants as being fully awakened beings who are free of the cycle of rebirth, and that's the end of that. There are others who hold the viewpoint based on the Lotus Sutra that although Arahants are in fact enlightened and free of rebirth, they will eventually take the form of a Sammāsambuddha. And this also I find an interesting concept. Whether it's true or not is kind of beside the point, because what it actually shows is that it's perfectly fine to become an Arahant. Because if you are worried that you can't be a Sammāsambuddha, then this viewpoint would be that, well, you can still become a Sammāsambuddha. You can become an Arahant first and then a Sammāsambuddha later on. And that's perfectly acceptable. A similar derived viewpoint is that an Arahant who, at the point of passing away, they've completely relinquished all self-identity. So then any sense of separation from all Sammāsambuddhas throughout space and time is therefore also irrelevant. Another way of looking at this is that any fully awakened being has transcended self-identity, transcended space and time, and therefore has direct unity with all Sammāsambuddhas throughout space and time. Any awakened being, whether an Arahant, a Paccekabuddha, or a Sammāsambuddha. So this also makes this distinction of Arahant and Sammāsambuddha kind of irrelevant, because it only persists while the being is still alive in human form. It's only during that period of time that there seems to be a distinction. And that distinction is also only relevant to us unenlightened beings. This is another important thing to keep in mind, is that what we are interacting with are the physical projections of an awakened being in our own mind. So why is it that we're living at a time when the Sammāsambuddha has passed away more than 2,000 years ago? Well, it's because that's our own defilements and delusions getting in the way. That's why. That's why we're having this experience. That's why we don't see a living Sammāsambuddha in front of us. It's because of our own defilements and delusions. That's why we're having this experience. Why is it that we sometimes meet people who, even though they're very advanced on the path, we don't seem capable of learning from them? Again, it's our own defilements and delusions getting in the way. So is it necessarily the case that an Arahant is incapable of teaching, or a Paccekabuddha is incapable of teaching, or a Sammāsambuddha has already passed away? Is that actually the case? Or is that just the manifestation of our own karma? The manifestation of our own karmic obstacles and obscurations? Interesting things to ponder and think about. And I've totally lost the thread. What was the question again? Let me make sure I've answered the question properly.
What are the differences between the three Buddhas in Mahayana and Theravada? Can their disparate views be reconciled?
Yes, I think I've sufficiently answered that so far, except for the Vajrayana school. So in Vajrayana Buddhism, they redefined Arahants as meaning someone who has removed all greed and all delusion. Who's removed all greed and all aversion, but not all delusion. someone who still has the delusion of independent self-existence and still has attachment to individual self-existence. Which in the Theravada school, we would call that a non-returner. We would not call that an Arhat, we'd call that a non-returner. So I recall a few years back, I had a quite heated debate with a Tibetan geshe. Actually, he's a Westerner who got a geshe degree in India at a Tibetan monastery. Quite heated debate because he kept saying that Arahants are delusional and that they're attached to self-identity. And I was like, no, they're not. They're free of delusion and free of self-attachment. They can't possibly be spoken of in that way. And I finally realized that it's just because in his training, the word Arahant means what the word non-returner means in the Theravada system. So that was causing this disconnect between us. And the concept of Arahant seems to be actually absent from their system. They only seem to have non-returner and then Sammāsambuddha. But the Arahant stage seems to have completely disappeared. So I don't know quite how that happened. But in East Asian Mahāyāna, again, there's two main schools of thought, one which slots up very neatly with the Theravada system. And then there's another school of thought which is the one I've already described. The one that slots up neatly with Theravada is the one I already described. The other school of thought is saying that Arahants are lacking in some development of wisdom, which is why some of them can teach and some can't, and why there's this interesting thing from the Pali Suttas, which indicates that a Sammāsambuddha has certain knowledges and capabilities, which an Arahant does not have. And so that therefore an Arahant will continue developing their wisdom faculty until it equals a Sammāsambuddha. So an Arahant will remain in samsara until they've perfected all the wisdom capabilities of a Sammāsambuddha as well. And from a Theravada standpoint, then we would say, well, if that's the case, then it would have to be in the Pureland. It would have to be in the Suddhavasa, the pure abodes. But again, this is a point of debate, and opinions are not unified even among Mahayanists on this one, let alone among Theravadins.
And Sally says, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da.
So based on Ayasoma's ominous sounds, I'm assuming this is a major question.
So Bhante would like to be a Buddha? I asked because Bhante said interested in Bodhisattva path.
I feel a strong affinity with the Bodhisattva path, and I feel a strong affinity with the Arahant path. And I don't know yet which one is stronger. We'll find out. Okay.
So you didn't answer.
That's
Would
correct.
you like to be a Buddha?
I'm interested in enlightenment. I'm interested in attaining enlightenment. And I'm interested in being of as much benefit to others as I can. I'm interested in attaining enlightenment, and I'm interested in helping other people attain enlightenment.
All right. And Marielle says, so we could have awakened beings just helping people out in the streets or teaching ethics in a university or so on, inspiring people around them just by being there?
I'm not so sure about teaching ethics in a university, but definitely the other ones. Would they? Well, I guess it could happen, teaching ethics in a university. Yeah, I guess so. What we seem to see from the suttas is that usually they focus on teaching Dhamma. But I guess through the form of an ethics class in a university, that's one way you could do it. Yeah, I've never really thought about that. But yeah, I guess it's conceivable. Yeah.
Okay, so we have still quite a few questions, so I think it's time for some answers.
The Zen answers are not going to satisfy.
Victor said, well, maybe some Theravāda.
Okay.
Not too long, not too short. Victor says, is it wrong for me to assume people who are born in Sukhavati actually are people that achieve anagami, since both only born one more time?
From a Theravada standpoint, in order to be born in the Pure Land, you must be a non-returner. And to some extent, this is backed up by the Pure Land Sutras themselves, because the Pure Land Sutras themselves state that if someone is born in Sukhavati, then they will never fall from that world. And they are bound to attain enlightenment without falling from that world. So this is how the Suddhavasa is described in the Theravada system. And again, it matches the definition of a non-returner. So in the, if we were focusing only on the Pure Land tradition, then usually the way it's talked about is that one must have pure morality, so perfect sila, perfect morality. One must have unshakable faith in Amitabha Buddha and in the existence of Sukhavati, the Pure Land. And one must have the unshakable determination to be reborn in the Pure Land. That's said to be the three basic requirements. The attainment of the complete elimination of desire and aversion, you could possibly include that under perfect sila. I think that would not be too much of a stretch. Perfect faith in Amitabha, in the Pure Land, that could fit under abandoning skepticism and Silabhata Paramasa, the wrong grasp of habitual practices. The sticky spot is Sakaya Ditti. So identification as body and mind. That's the sticky spot. That's where a Pure Land practitioner might run into some problems. But yeah, I would say that if one does sufficiently address Sakaya Ditti, one's attachment to body and mind, recognizing I am not this body, I am not this mind, nonetheless, I wish to be reborn in the Pure Land so I may attain full enlightenment more easily, then it's possible. That may help one to develop the necessary qualities to be reborn in the Pure Land.
Right, and Galaxy from Malaysia says, can an Arhat finally become a Buddha, for example, developed with the abilities at par with the Buddha?
I think I answered that question already. Yeah.
James says, I remember how surprised I was when I counted and realized the brown viharas are name dropped more than the Anapanasati. That always stood out to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, the principles of universal compassion are all throughout the Pali Suttas. Again, I don't know how anyone can pretend there's no compassion in Theravada. One has to be incredibly selective in how one reads the suttas in order to read out all the compassion.
Yeah, facts. And now there are lots of amusing comments, I think, from your imitation of poker, poker. James says, Bhante, you got me a belly aches laughing here. And Elaine says, Bhante had to be a stand-up comedian in another life.
Yeah, it's actually a good thing that monastics aren't allowed to gamble, because Ayasoma would lose terribly.
Maya says we should have a whole talk just with Bhante showing the face expressions of Aya. Great impersonations. And Sally says, is there a sentence like sound here, disciples 35, all Arahants in Pure Land in the oldest Amitabha Sutra? If so, what is Bhante's thoughts about Arahant appearing in the Pure Land, especially pursuing the Bodhisattva path?
Well, first off, the whole concept of the sound hearer, which is a very awkward translation of the word savaka, which usually we translate it as disciple, but it literally means listener. This whole thing of like describing Arahants as savakas is something that appears in later Mahayana texts. And it's almost always used in a disparaging, insulting way. So I don't know where I'm not so fond of the use of the word savakayana or sound hearer vehicle. I'm not so fond of it. It's basically used similarly to the word hinayana, which also I'm not fond of. Anyway, what was the question again?
Don't remember anymore.
Does it appear in the old
The
Amitabha
Arahats,
Sutra?
yeah.
So the oldest Amitabha Sutra basically just says that if one sets their mind on rebirth in the Pure Land, then one can be reborn there, and that will be very helpful for attaining awakening. That's basically it. And most of the really problematic Pure Land doctrines come from the more recent sutras. They don't come from the old ones.
And Victor is asking, I hear some Bodhisattva involves the vows they will not attain Nirvana before being attained Nirvana. I think that is an impossible vow. What do you think, Bhante?
Yeah, it is an impossible vow. And that's what makes it so powerful. So a vow like that, it has the purpose of completely wearing away one's self-centeredness, completely wearing away one's aversion to samsara, and wearing away one's aversion or partiality towards sentient beings. So it's a very wholesome vow, but it doesn't prevent one from attaining enlightenment. If it did, there would be no Buddhas.
All right, and Cam says, it's wonderful to try to understand differences between Theravāda and Mahāyāna from an open heart, but should be cautious not to seek differences, to create division, or to point out which is better. The beauty of Buddhism is the openness to all, regardless different practices. Theravadins can enter Mahayana temples and vice versa. Facts.
Yeah, and that's actually been my experience. My experience has been that, generally speaking, anywhere in the Buddhist world where monastics are practicing well, then practitioners of all traditions are welcome, without looking down on anyone or excluding anyone. Everyone's welcome. That's been my experience. The difficulties that I occasionally run into are with people who don't understand Buddhism particularly well and who are not strong practitioners. That's where I sometimes run into prejudice or misunderstandings. Yeah, like I've spent a fair amount of time living visiting Mahayana monasteries, dressed in Theravada style robes, and they're just happy I'm there. Like there's no trace of thinking less of me just because I'm wearing Theravada style robes. And similarly, I can talk about Mahayana ideas and concepts with well-developed Theravada monks, and they're not the least bit bothered. Some of them are bothered, but those are the ones who don't seem to understand Buddhism terribly well.
Bradley says, if someone's working towards enlightenment in this life or many others, then that's praiseworthy in my humble opinion. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Yeah, also not to get so caught up on this whole idea of lifetimes. It'll take however long it takes. Just set your sights on awakening and keep moving it towards it. Don't worry about how many lifetimes it takes. Just keep moving in the right direction and you'll get there when you get there. So we're almost out of time. So I think, is there any?
There are lots of other, very fast. Elaine asks, what are your thoughts on the new Kadampa Buddhism meditation center in my city? They do analytical meditation. There is one center in. Maybe send us an email.
Send us an email. Yes.
They have a bit of a questionable reputation. If you Google, you will find out a lot of information.
Go on Google and type New Kadampa Controversy.
And then you can decide for yourself.
Yeah. Okay.
Sally says, the Bodhisattva's question above is from what I heard before, that Bodhisattva vow will prevent someone from attaining stream entry. But Bhante's answer gave me a bright new thought. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily. It doesn't necessarily prevent you. Keep in mind, a Bodhisattva has to attain stream entry eventually anyway.
Gabriella says, where are the Suddhavasa of the Pure Lands in the Theravada cosmology?
So they're depending on who you ask, they're either the lowest of the formless realms or the highest of the form realms. Either way, they are realms of existence, heaven realms, which are accessible only to non-returners and arhants and inhabited only by non-returners and arhants. It's mentioned in many, many places throughout the suttas. In fact, there's a handful of amusing suttas where non-returner devas from the Pure Land come and talk to monks and tell them, like, get your stuff together, you're being too lazy. Okay, keep going.
There's an amusing comment by Sally. Thank you for Bhante's compassion so we can continue to hear BI's talk before Bhante attains enlightenment. Clap, clap.
That's very sweet.
Hopefully, actually, he will attain enlightenment right now, and we'll still keep hearing his talks after awakening.
You don't cease to exist when you attain enlightenment.
Boom, disappear.
Yeah.
And Kevin is reminding people to practice dana. So if you're able to help, please visit BuddhistInsights.com/donate to support the monastery and these talks. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, Kevin. And Drew says, Bhante, I once came across a discussion in which a person seemed to be justifying euthanasia for a dying animal based on a skillful means understanding of a Pali Sutta in which the Buddha places a whiff of goodwill above the 5 precepts, as if goodwill is more wholesome than precept keeping. Therefore, killing based on goodwill is greater than the bad karma of killing. Is this Dhamma? This person claimed to be Ekayana. Ooh.
Yeah, that's definitely not Dhamma. Yeah, no killing. Euthanasia is not goodwill, it's just killing. We need to be really clear on that. So in this country, there's this custom of people killing their pets whenever they get old or sick. I think this is horrifying. And there's no basis for it in the suttas. So in the suttas, the Buddha says quite clearly, he says, like in one place in the Dhammapada, he says, all beings fear death and want to live. Knowing this, we refrain from killing and causing others to kill. No, the Buddha was very, very unequivocal on this. We should never, ever, 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 ever intentionally kill another living being. Ever. Unthinkable. Okay.
All right. And with that, I think we're done for the evening. Right on time. Actually, 3 minutes late, but this is great. All right. Thank you so much for all your great questions. And thank you so much, Bhante, for your teachings as usual. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May all beings attain awakening eventually, right now, tomorrow, in a few years, in a few eons, in a few lifetimes, in this lifetime. Whenever they can.
Yeah.
And may you all have a great, see you tomorrow at 8 a.m.